The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 6th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were beside the sea, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." So they said to him, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe in you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it was my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The Gospel of the Lord. That's nice, but what have you done for me lately? That is a question that often gets asked of politicians in an election year. It's a question that employees sometimes feel like they're being asked during annual performance reviews, and it is essentially the question that people ask Jesus in today's gospel reading. That's nice, but what have you done for me lately? To set the stage for this question, Jesus has just performed a great sign, what John calls a sign. All the miracles in John's gospel are called signs. And it's the miracle of the feeding of 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And afterwards, as we read last week, Jesus withdrew himself up to a mountain while his disciples got in a boat and headed out onto the lake. In the middle of the night, Jesus came walking on the water, which scared the heck out of the disciples, but Jesus told them not to be afraid, and just as he was going to get into the boat with them, all of a sudden they arrive at the dock in Capernaum, which is a town where many of the disciples came from and from which they apparently used it as a base of their operations. Since nobody back in that crowd knew where Jesus and his disciples had went, many folks in that crowd of people who ate the food decided to get into the boats themselves and go looking for Jesus in Capernaum, because that's where they often hung out. And who knows, maybe Jesus will do this trick again. So when they arrive in Capernaum, they find Jesus, and they've clearly been telling others what had just happened. Yet they act all surprised and go, "Well, Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus, on the other hand, knows the drill, and he tells them, "Hey, you're not looking for me because you saw signs from God. You're looking at me because you want more free stuff from God." Undaunted, the folks in the crowd say, "Okay, if you want us to believe in you and see God at work, what sign are you going to give us?" That is, "Yes, we just saw this great sign, but that was so yesterday. What have you done for us lately? Or what are you going to do for us now so that maybe we'll vote for you for Messiah?" Jesus tells them that if they really want to see the sign of God's presence in the world around them, they have to be about the works of God. And that work, he says, is to believe in the one whom he sent, not a particular set of doctrines. Now, as Lutherans, we generally recoil at the idea that believing is a work. Because after all, faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit that empowers us to trust God and to live boldly as God's people. It is not something that we can do for ourselves. But that's not really what Jesus is talking about here. Instead, Jesus is calling people to understand that the work of believing is not about doing something so that you're worthy of God's love and help. Instead, this work of believing is about living in such a way that you see and feel and appreciate the signs of God's love and presence in the world around you, which were always there and are always going to be there, but which you may not be able to see or feel or appreciate unless you live into this work of believing. And particularly in John's gospel, and we're going to read this gospel for another few weeks yet, believing is not about cognitive assent to some kind of set of doctrine or principles. Instead, believing is about focusing on God instead of all the other chaos in the world around you. Doesn't mean putting your head in the sand and not dealing with the chaos, but it does mean not letting God get lost in the midst of the storm, as seemed to happen to the disciples when they were out on the boat in the midst of that storm a few weeks ago. And they got so caught up in the wind and the waves that Jesus, who was right there in the boat with them, didn't seem to be all that important at all, except maybe as a guy who, if he woke up, he could help them bail the boat. Believing in John's gospel is about trusting God instead of yourself. And this is really the problem with the question they asked Jesus, what must we do? Because the folks who asked that question wanted to know whether they could control God. If I do this, then God has to do this other thing. Therefore, I can manipulate God to give me whatever I want. But that isn't trust in a loving and caring God. It's more of a contractual idea that God only works if I work. And in that case, I will never be looking for God to do something generous and undeserved, like feeding those 5,000 people on a hillside, because I'm too busy worrying about whether I have done enough to earn stuff from God. And believing, especially in John's gospel, is about acting in the ways that Jesus calls us to act. It's about getting involved in what Jesus calls us to do so that we can often see the works of God through what we do. And one of the keys to understanding what believing is about in the Bible is to realize that believing is never a passive thing that you just think in your head or feel in your heart. Believing is about taking leaps of faith and doing things you feel called by God to do, just like the disciples did when they started passing out the bread and the fish to that crowd. They didn't know exactly what they were doing, but they saw the sign of God's presence because they did the things Jesus asked them to do. And they didn't know how all these things would actually help or even work out, but believing, they knew, meant taking action. And the important point is that when you believe in those ways, you actually may begin to see and feel and appreciate the signs of God's presence working in the world around you and even working in you and through you. That's why this work of believing is important for us. It's not so that we can earn God's love or approval or so that we can get lots of neat stuff from God. Instead, it's so that we also can be people who see, feel, and appreciate the presence of God and God's love in us and in the world around us. And for us too, if we want to see a sign like those folks were asking for of God's love and presence, it's often found when we focus on God's acts instead of the chaos that often swirls around us. Because, you know, there was a lot of political and social upheaval in the first century as well, and people got hooked up and they got caught up into it. But the sign that Jesus often gave was simply the sharing of bread and the feeding of hungry people. And sometimes for us, the signs we should be looking for are the simple and almost unnoticed signs of people being helped and healed and befriended. Those are the signs of God at work in the world. If we want to see a sign of God's love and presence, it's often found when we trust God instead of ourselves. Because it's often the case that when things get messy, at least for me, I want to try to get things back under control. I will put a little plastic thingy around it so that things are not as messy. But sometimes the signs in my life, and maybe in yours too, have been when I've actually realized that God is actually present and doing things that happen completely outside of my control, and which indeed seem to happen in spite of the fact that no one, sometimes not even me, is cooperating. And sometimes if we want to see a sign of God's presence in the world around us, it means actually acting to be the hands of Jesus in the world around us. And you know, whether it's been on mission trips when people went to Honduras or simply collecting school supplies as we do every fall, it's often been the case around here that people have seen and felt the signs of God working in and through them when we stop wondering about ourselves and simply act to be agents of passing out some kind of bread in the lives of others. And sometimes that's also meant experiencing the signs of God working in us and through us that simply wouldn't have been there if we just sat back, folded our hands, and said, "Okay, God, lay it on me." You know, in John's Gospel, there are 5 things that Jesus did, which John calls signs. But when Jesus did those things, he did not do them to show off or to say, "Hey, these 5, it's all you get." Instead, he did those signs so that his disciples, like us, could begin to recognize the signs that God is always doing things in the world around us and in and through us. But to actually see and feel and appreciate those signs, we often have to be about the work of believing. And for us, like those first disciples, the work of believing often means focusing on the small acts of love and mercy in our lives instead of all the noisy chaos around us. For us, like those first disciples, the work of believing often means giving up on our need to control what's going on around us as though life, the universe, and everything depended upon us. And for us, like those first disciples, the work of believing often means taking leaps of faith to act in ways that open us up to ourselves being the signs of God's presence and care in the lives of others.